Welcome once again to The Curious Case. I'm Davis, and I'm so glad you're here for another quiet mystery. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what's the weather like where you are? Share it in the comments. And remember to subscribe, so you never miss our next evening in Street Mary Mead. The train whistled once, then slowed, dragging its echo through the fog. Steel hissed, brakes sighed, and the night seemed to hold its breath. A dim lamp flickered near the platform's edge. Its glass hummed, moths circling like ghosts that refused to rest. Through the mist a figure appeared, hat pulled low, coat buttoned tight. He paused under the lamplight, checking his watch though the glass was cracked. Across the platform, a suitcase lay tipped open. A glove hung half out of it, small, pale, untouched by dirt. No one claimed it. No one even looked. The porter coughed once, too loudly for comfort, and turned away. From the far end, another figure stepped down, quiet, graceful, hesitant. A woman in grey, her eyes fixed on the man with the broken watch. Neither spoke. They only stood in the hum of steam, the space between them heavy with something unspoken. The whistle blew again, shorter this time. Passengers shifted, feet scraped, doors clanged. But the woman didn't move. And when the train pulled away, its sound swallowed by the fog, only her shadow remained. The lamplight steadied for a moment, then flickered out. On the wooden bench nearby, something gleamed faintly in the mist, a small silver locket, open, its chain twisted. Inside, a face blurred with moisture. The wind lifted one torn ticket stub beside it, sliding it toward the rails before settling it under the wheel track. From across the lane, Miss Marple, returning from her evening visit to the vicarage, paused by the gate. She saw the empty bench, the faint glow of the signal shed, and the locket glinting once before disappearing under shadow. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Something or someone had missed their train. Morning brought weak light and stronger opinions. By 9, the station was a hive of talk. Porter Jenkins, broom in hand and pride in posture, declared he'd seen a gentleman too fine for that hour. He said it once for the postmistress, again for the milkman, each time adding another thread of mystery. The sort what carries London in his shoes, he added, tapping his broom handle, and trouble in his pockets. Mrs. Fletcher from the tea shop disagreed. Not trouble, romance, she said, pouring from the kettle that never boiled fast enough. There was a lady, too. You know the kind, hat too neat, bag too close. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. Looked right through him, nodded him through him. The milkman chuckled, already forming his own version. Then maybe he deserved it. Outside, Miss Marple walked past the open window, her shopping basket swinging lightly. She didn't linger, but her pace slowed. Voices carried easily in Street Mary Mead, especially when they weren't meant to. At the platform, Jenkins was still sweeping the same patch of wood he'd swept an hour earlier. He nodded at her politely. Terrible thing, miss. Someone left luggage behind last night. Station master says he'll turn it over to the police if unclaimed. He gestured with his chin. Over there. Half open, damp from the fog. Not a label on it either. Odd, ain't it? Marple looked briefly where he pointed just enough to notice a scrap of fabric caught under the handle. Pale grey wool. Torn. She said only, odd indeed, and moved on. At the grocer's, Mrs. Dracott was already retelling the tale, now with a scream added for seasoning. Said the porter heard it. She told anyone within range. Faint, like wind crying through the hedge. A woman's voice, surely. Her husband sighed. Or a kettle, dear. We've been fooled by steam before. Mrs. Dracott ignored him. It's always steam until it's blood, she whispered dramatically. Miss Marple accepted her sugar ration with a kind smile. People were so certain when they didn't know, so certain when it was safe to be. Outside, a church bell struck the half-hour. The sound carried across the lane, mixing with faint laughter from the tea shop. Somewhere, a child called out for his mother. Ordinary sounds wrapped around something that wasn't ordinary at all. Miss Marple paused at the corner, her eyes drifting toward the station roofline. A pigeon perched there, watching the tracks, still, silent, waiting. She adjusted her gloves, turned homeward, and thought of the locket under the bench, and the wool thread no one else had seen. She didn't speak of it. She didn't need to. She remembered that tone. By noon, the fog had lifted just enough for gossip to grow legs. Children darted between the platform rails, chasing paper scraps blown from the porter's bin, while adults gathered in that leisurely, self-appointed way of people waiting for someone else's tragedy to clarify. Mrs. Fletcher was the first to see it. Not the suitcase that had been moved to the office, but something smaller, stranger. Near the signal shed, half hidden in a tuft of grass, a pocket watch lay open, ticking faintly. Its glass was spider-cracked, the hands arrested at 11:48. A train time. Not quite midnight. Not quite safe. Jenkins picked it up with 2 fingers, as if afraid it might still be warm. "Good make," he muttered. "Silver case. Too good for forgetting." The station master frowned. No initials, no chain either. Could belong to anyone. But the others had already begun to build stories around it. "A gentleman's," said Mrs. Fletcher. "Or a thief's," added the postmistress, who disliked all men who carried watches finer than her husband's. "Dropped in a hurry," guessed the milkman. "Hurry or struggle." Miss Marple stood a little apart, her hands folded neatly over her gloves. She didn't step forward. She only watched how they looked at it. The small object suddenly transformed into evidence, each eye seeing its own fear reflected in the crack of glass. The inspector hadn't yet arrived, but the performance had begun without him. Voices layered. Speculations bloomed. One woman insisted the watch had stopped at the exact moment of death. Another argued it had been planted to mislead. Jenkins, proud of his discovery, suggested perhaps the owner had fainted. "No one faints like that," the postmistress snapped. Miss Marple's gaze drifted from the watch to the wood beneath it. A faint smear of dark polish crossed the edge of the platform, shaped like a shoe sole that had slipped sideways. Beside it, a thread, not grey this time, but red, clung to the wood grain, barely visible unless the sun caught it just so. She bent slightly, as if admiring the porter's sweeping, and brushed her fingertip along the mark. Dust. And something else. Perfume, faint, too delicate for a station morning. Jasmine again. She straightened quietly. "Odd that such a fine watch should stop here," Jenkins said, still holding it. Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Perhaps it didn't stop," she said. "Perhaps it waited." The group blinked at her, unsure whether to laugh. She gave no further explanation. Instead, she glanced toward the far end of the platform, where a notice board leaned crookedly against the wall. Someone had tacked a new schedule there that morning, trains listed, times precise. But one was crossed out in pencil, the 11:50. The crowd followed her eyes but saw nothing unusual. To them, it was just another timetable. To her, it was the echo of a question the watch itself seemed to ask. Who stopped first, the train or the truth? Inspector Cray arrived from Melchester just before 3. Neat coat, polished shoes, the kind of man who trusted order to explain chaos. He stepped down from the motor car, notebook in hand, and surveyed the scene with a sigh that suggested experience and boredom. "Lost property, most likely," he said briskly. "Someone drops a watch, panics, can't find it, and makes off before dawn." The crowd nodded. Easy answers settled well in small villages. Jenkins cleared his throat. "There was a lady too, sir. Red hat. Arrived same time as the gentleman." Cray didn't look up from his notes. "And she's gone, is she?" "Vanished, sir." He closed the notebook sharply. "Then she's alive and well. Likely eloped if she had any sense." The tea shop murmured approval. Elopement was respectable mischief. Mrs. Fletcher stepped closer, lowering her voice as though sharing a holy secret. She was carrying a bag, clutching it tight. Some say it held money. "Some always do," Cray replied dryly. "Any signs of violence?" "None, sir." "Then it's theft or sentiment. Either way, it's not a mystery." The station master nodded too eagerly. "Train ran on schedule. Platform clear. If anyone met trouble, it wasn't here." The inspector smiled faintly. "There you are, Miss Marple. Nothing for your imagination to do today." She returned the smile, polite, unruffled. "Oh, I rarely imagine, Inspector. I simply notice." He tilted his head. "And what have you noticed?" She hesitated, as if reluctant to spoil the neatness. "Only that the watch stopped at 11:48, yet the last train left at 11:47. So? So time doesn't usually wait for trains." A few chuckled. Cray didn't. Perhaps the watch was slow. "Perhaps," she said gently. He turned back to his car. "File it as a domestic matter. Someone will report a missing article soon enough." The words carried authority, the kind that ends. Questions before they grow dangerous. He climbed into the car, waved once to the crowd, and was gone. As the dust settled, villagers repeated his logic like scripture. "Domestic matter," they said. "Lost property. Nothing criminal." Relief disguised as certainty. Miss Marple lingered near the bench where the locket had been found. She traced a fingertip across the wood. Still faintly scented jasmine, yes, but also something sharper now, metallic, the kind of smell left by a coin warmed in the hand. Behind her, Mrs. Dracott sighed with satisfaction. "Thank heavens it's settled. I can't bear unfinished stories." Marple smiled. "Most people can't," she replied softly. Then, after a pause long enough for her meaning to settle where it would, she added, "Neat stories often hide messy truths." The knock came just after 4. Soft, hesitant. The kind of sound made by someone deciding, even as they did it, whether to run. Miss Marple set down her knitting and opened the door. A woman stood there, mid-30s perhaps, neatly dressed in travelling grey, gloves buttoned, hat pinned just so. Her expression was calm, but her hands betrayed her. One clutched a handbag too tightly, the other twisted the strap in small, silent turns. "I'm so sorry to intrude," she began, voice measured, almost too precise. "I was told you might have found something at the station last night. A glove. Left hand. Kid leather. Pale color. It might be mine." Miss Marple smiled in that gentle, grandmotherly way that put people off guard. "No, I'm afraid not, my dear. But do come in. We can sit and think where it might have gone." The woman hesitated only a second before stepping inside. The warmth of the cottage seemed to startle her. She removed one glove, the right, and placed it neatly on the table beside her bag. The hand beneath was pale, the knuckles faintly reddened, as if from cold or pressure. "Such a dreadful evening for travel," Miss Marple said lightly, pouring tea. "The fog turns everything into rumour." The woman smiled thinly. "Yes, it does that." Her tone suggested she understood more than the words implied. "You came on the late train, perhaps?" The cup paused halfway to her lips. "I did. From London. I wasn't meant to stop here, but I felt unwell." "A sensible decision," Miss Marple said. "Street Mary Mead is very peaceful for resting." The woman nodded, but didn't drink. Instead, she glanced toward the window, as though expecting movement outside. A shadow passed along the hedge, only the postboy, but she flinched nonetheless. "You're staying nearby?" "With a cousin in Much Benham." "Ah, and the glove?" "I thought I might have dropped it near the platform steps. It's sentimental, you see." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Of course. Sentimental things are so easily misplaced, and so rarely found." The woman looked up quickly, eyes too bright. For a moment, the mask slipped, then reappeared just as fast. "I should go," she said, rising abruptly. "Thank you for your time, Miss Marple," she supplied gently. "Do take another cup for the road." The woman shook her head, smiling that polite, stitched-on smile again. "Another time, perhaps." She left quickly, her steps light on the path, her shadow folding into the mist. Miss Marple stood at the window, watching until the gate clicked shut. On the table, the faintest trace of scent remained sweet, deliberate, and utterly out of place in an afternoon of damp air and coal smoke. "Jasmine." She wrote the word in her small notebook. "Perfume lingers longer than courage." Evening settled quietly over Street Mary Mead. The mist had thinned, but the air carried that peculiar stillness that comes after conversation has left the day behind. Miss Marple sat at her writing table near the window, the small lamp casting a gentle circle of light across her open diary. She uncapped her pen, its nib perfectly sharp, used for noting, not dreaming. On the first page beneath the date, she began to write. Glove, watch, locket, perfume. Each word stood alone, small islands of curiosity. She regarded them the way some people study weather, looking for the shift that explains what's coming. The glove, of course, might be nothing. Women lose gloves as naturally as they breathe, but this one she thought was not lost, it was searched for. That made all the difference. The watch came next. Stopped at 11:48, though the last train had left a minute earlier. A discrepancy too small to notice, except that time, like conscience, never slips without reason. Someone had wanted to remember that moment, or pretend to. The locket, she leaned back slightly. No one in the village had claimed it, yet it was no trinket. The hinge was worn smooth by years of handling, the photograph inside blurred not by water, but by touch. A picture looked at too often to forget, yet too painful to keep clear. And the perfume jasmine was the oddest clue of all. It didn't belong to this landscape of damp hedgerows and coal fires. It belonged to drawing rooms, late nights, and careful disguises. Someone had carried it deliberately, the way people carry fragments of their past to remind themselves who they once were or to hide who they still are. She drew small lines between each word, a habit she'd acquired over decades of tea-time puzzles. Connections not yet solid, but suggested by instinct. Between glove and locket, she wrote, ownership. Between watch and perfume, timing. And beneath them all, a single shared note, hesitation. She murmured softly, half to herself. People don't vanish without leaving the shape of their fear behind. From outside, the faint creak of a cartwheel turned down the lane, the rhythm steady, harmless. But Miss Marple had lived too long to mistake. Stillness for peace. She looked once more at the list, tapping the pen against her chin. Fear explained caution. Guilt explained silence. But hesitation, that was something else. It belonged to people who saw a choice and could not move toward either side. It was not evil, merely human, and that made it the most dangerous of all. She underlined the final 4 words with neat precision. Fear, guilt, hesitation, truth. Then she circled one lightly, almost tenderly before closing the book. Hesitation. The post came late that morning. A small stack gas bill, church circular, and one plain envelope without a return address. Miss Marple turned it over in her hands. The paper was thin, the sort sold in railway kiosks, and the ink had bled faintly, as though written in haste or with trembling fingers. No seal, just a neat fold. She opened it carefully, smoothing the page on her writing table. The handwriting was delicate, measured, each letter formed with the precision of someone taught long ago to control emotion through penmanship. Dear Madam, you were kind to me yesterday, though you did not need to be. I fear I may have caused you inconvenience, but I wished only to thank you before I go. Circumstances require that I leave sooner than planned. Please do not trouble yourself should anyone ask after me. I am safe, and my affairs are now my own. You will understand, I think, that peace is sometimes found only by walking away. Yours faithfully. No name. No address. Just a faint blot at the bottom corner, as if a tear or perhaps a drop of rain had interrupted the ink. Miss Marple read it twice. Then a third time, slower. The phrasing struck her first, before I go. Not before I leave the village, not before I travel, just before I go. A small difference, yet it shifted the weight of the sentence entirely. The next phrase, you will understand. People only wrote that when they hoped not to be, questioned, or when they feared they soon couldn't be. And the line about peace. No one searching for peace writes about it in the present tense. Peace is always a promise, never a possession. She turned the letter toward the light. The ink shimmered slightly in one corner, revealing the faintest fingerprint smudge. Fine, narrow, a woman's hand. Likely the same that had held the teacup yesterday and refused to drink. Miss Marple folded the paper again, her fingers steady. She slipped it into her diary between the pages marked hesitation and truth. Outside, a clock struck 11 clear, unhurried. A train whistle followed moments later, distant but sharp, drifting through the open window like an unfinished thought. She sat very still, listening until the sound faded completely. It was not the tone of departure she heard, but of finality, the kind of sound that suggests something has already ended, and only the world remains to notice. Her eyes fell once more on the folded page beside the teacup. Such tidy words, such careful pen strokes, but the spaces between them spoke louder than the ink. She wasn't asking for help. Miss Marple murmured softly, closing the book. She was saying goodbye. Inspector Cray arrived again that afternoon, his shoes still marked from the previous visit, his patience already thinner. He didn't wait to be invited in. He simply stepped through Miss Marple's gate, holding his hat beneath his arm like a man carrying proof. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said briskly. "Thought I'd bring you up to date before the whole village invents its own conclusions." She gestured him inside, poured tea as though entertaining a friend rather than a man intent on simplifying the world. He set his briefcase down with a small thud and began. "The missing lady's been identified, we think. Lydia Rowe, or so her cousin claims. Arrived from London on the late train. There's a record of her purchasing a return ticket. Likely fell ill, as she said, or changed her mind and left this morning on the early service." He paused just long enough to let the logic settle. Everything points to a simple case of a traveller gone astray. Miss Marple stirred her cup gently. "Yet the porter insists no lady boarded the morning train." Cray smiled tightly. "Porters remember ghosts when there's gossip to feed them. Perhaps she slipped out early, hired a motor. Happens often. And the watch? Coincidence. Dropped by another passenger, possibly the same gentleman seen last night. We've sent the description to London." He leaned back. "These coincidences happen all the time." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "But they rarely arrive in pairs." Cray frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning coincidences are like fog, Inspector. One can accept a patch, but when it covers the whole field, it's no longer weather, it's concealment." He exhaled through his nose, resisting irritation. "You do enjoy making puzzles, don't you, Miss Marple?" "Oh, not puzzles," she replied mildly. "Patterns." He opened his briefcase, withdrew the letter she'd mentioned earlier. "You were right about this arriving by post," he said. "But the handwriting matches one we found on a telegram sent from the Melchester office this morning. Same style. Same ink. She's alive." Miss Marple studied the paper without touching it. "Alive, yes, but not at peace. Letters like this aren't sent by the living so much as by those rehearsing absence." Cray blinked. "Rehearsing absence? It's when people begin to vanish from their own story before anyone notices." He shook his head, closing the case again. "You see tragedy in every line, Miss Marple, but the world's simpler than that." She smiled faintly. "That must be very comforting." He stood, straightening his coat. "Well, the facts will sort themselves out. They always do." She walked him to the door, polite as ever. "Indeed, Inspector. Facts explain actions." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "But feelings explain timing." He hesitated, as though sensing meaning he couldn't quite reach, then tipped his hat and left. The gate clicked shut behind him. Miss Marple returned to her tea. It had gone cold. Evening descended early, the kind that made lamps bloom before supper. Street Mary Mead sank into its usual hush, fires lit, curtains drawn, dogs called in from the lanes. Only the faint hum of a wireless somewhere down the street gave proof that life, though muted, still persisted. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting untouched in her lap. The fog had returned, not heavy but restless, folding and unfolding along the hedgerows like something alive. From her vantage point, she could see the faint shape of the station roof through the trees, a dull silhouette against the deepening blue. Every evening she took note of small things: who shut their gate early, which chimney smoked longer than usual, whether the milk cart rattled past twice instead of once. Those details, unnoticed by most, were the village's heartbeat, and tonight it was irregular. The lamplight near the station flickered, then steadied again. A harmless thing lamps often did. But this one had burned steady the night before, even through wind. Now it struggled, gasping between glow and shadow. She watched a figure appear beneath it. The porter Jenkins, perhaps. He paused, wiped his brow, and glanced toward the signal shed before disappearing around its far side. Nothing odd in that, except the light. When he vanished, it steadied, as though relieved. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, her fingers resting on the window latch. A faint sound followed the gentle metallic click of something being fastened, then the slow drag of gravel underfoot. Not hurried, not fearful, deliberate. The smell reached her next. A faint wisp of smoke, carried by the damp air, not from coal or pipe, but something sweeter, acrid beneath the sweetness. Jasmine, again, faint and out of place. No woman in the village wore it now. It belonged to someone who had wanted to be remembered in the dark. From the lane below, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The sound rippled through the quiet like a question no one dared answer. A shutter closed somewhere, and the mist thickened just enough to erase the station lamp from view. Miss Marple sat back, her eyes on the fading light. She thought of the letter folded in her diary, the one that spoke of peace found by walking away. But peace, she knew, did not smell of jasmine, nor did it come by train. The clock on her mantel chimed 8, steady, unhurried, certain. Outside, a second chime echoed faintly from the station clock, half a beat behind. 2 rhythms, nearly aligned but not quite. She listened to them overlap, like voices speaking the same truth at slightly different times. Somewhere, something had shifted. Not loudly, not visibly. Just enough to tell her that by morning, silence itself would sound different. She turned off her lamp and whispered, almost to the fog itself, "It's begun again." The clock struck midnight with the soft certainty of something that had done so for 100 years. Each chime hung in the air, fading slowly into the hush that followed. Miss Marple had not gone to bed. She rarely did when her mind refused to rest. The fog was thicker now, dense, low, and strangely luminous in the lamplight. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, stepped outside, and followed the narrow lane that led toward the station. Her footsteps made no sound on the damp path, though every twig seemed to crack louder than it should. From a distance, the platform appeared deserted. The lantern by the signal shed glowed weakly, the kind of light that wanted company. Somewhere in the distance, a train's faint rumble echoed a sound felt, more than heard, growing, passing, and fading again into nothing. Not the last train of the night, just one that didn't stop here anymore. She moved closer to the platform. The air smelled faintly of oil and something floral, sweet, sharp, misplaced. Jasmine. It hung heavier tonight, as if time itself had absorbed the scent. Near the bench where the locket had been found, she saw it something dark against the pale boards. She bent down slowly, steadying herself on the railing. A hat, crimson felt, rim slightly crushed, the edge damp with dew. A woman's hat. The same one she'd noticed yesterday, the one belonging to Mrs. Lydia Rowe, or whoever she truly was. Beside it lay a torn page from a railway timetable, half-soaked, half-readable. A single train time circled in pencil 11:50. The page trembled in the faint draught from a passing breeze. Miss Marple touched the hat lightly, her fingers brushing the brim. It was warm only faintly, but enough to suggest it had not lain there long. She straightened, her gaze sweeping across the platform, the shadows, the shed door. It hung open by an inch. Not wide enough for entry, but not closed enough for safety. Inside, something glinted. A watch, perhaps the same one found before, or another, just like it lying on the floor beneath the flickering bulb. She stepped no closer. There was no need. Her years had taught her that truth, like scent, travels on its own. She listened. No cry, no whisper, no footstep, only the faint, steady tick, mechanical, patient, defying silence. The fog pressed in, soft and deliberate. A droplet slid from the hat's rim, darkening the plank below. Miss Marple drew a slow breath and looked toward the railway line, stretching out into the night like a sentence unfinished. Something had ended here, she could feel it, But whether it was a life or only a lie, she could not yet tell. She turned back toward home, the hat left exactly as she'd found it. The wind shifted. The ticking grew softer, like a pulse buried too deep to save. No body, only the ticking. Morning came soft and golden, as though the village had politely agreed to forget the night. Birdsong replaced the whistle of trains. The air smelled of toast and coal smoke instead of fog and iron. At the tea shop, the talk had already begun its usual business of turning fear into small entertainment. Mrs. Fletcher poured coffee with theatrical calm. "Well, that settles it, doesn't it? Just some traveller's misfortune. Hat blew off in the wind, perhaps. Poor soul must have found her way home." Her audience nodded, grateful for an explanation that left no room for ghosts. The postmistress, ever eager to agree with whatever made her feel safest, added, "The inspector's satisfied, I hear. No body, no trouble. You can't arrest the weather." She laughed, a little too brightly. Miss Marple sat near the window, her knitting basket at her side, appearing entirely engaged with her tea. But she was listening. She always listened. From outside came the rhythmic creak of Jenkins' broom as he swept the platform boards for the third time that morning. He whistled a tune slightly off-key, but his eyes flickered constantly toward the shed door. When he noticed Miss Marple watching, he looked away too quickly. "Strange thing, though, Mrs." Fletcher continued. "The station master swears he saw someone near the signal lamp before dawn. Said it looked like a man in uniform." "Uniform?" The postmistress frowned. "Rail uniform? No polished buttons, dark coat, but too neat for a railway man." "Then who?" "Oh, he says he was half asleep. Probably a trick of the fog." Miss Marple smiled into her cup. Fog rarely played tricks, it only revealed them slowly. By midday, peace had become the village's new ritual. Children ran errands. Men discussed the price of potatoes. Even the church bell seemed less accusatory than to usual. Only the faint unease beneath the chatter betrayed that something still lingered. At the grocer's, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Dracott whispering to her husband. "They say Jenkins was at the station again last night. Past midnight. What business would a porter have sweeping in the dark?" Her husband grunted. "He's been drinking again, most likely." She lowered her voice. "Or meeting someone." "Don't start that again." But she did. "A lady, they say. One with perfume." Miss Marple paused by the apples, pretending to examine their ripeness. Perfume. The word fit too easily into her growing puzzle. Outside, the air had turned mild. Children laughed. The milk cart rattled past. To any visitor, Street Mary Mead would seem perfectly calm. But Miss Marple knew better. Calm in a village was never natural. It was arranged, negotiated, and maintained like a secret. The absence of curiosity, she knew, was not peace. It was relief disguised as virtue. She paid for her groceries, smiled at the shopkeeper, and stepped into the quiet street. Overhead, a crow landed on the telegraph wire, its cry sharp enough to cut through the morning air. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, eyes narrowing slightly toward the station road. "Peace," she murmured, "comes quickest where questions aren't welcome." By afternoon, the sky had turned the soft grey of unspoken things. A fine drizzle dusted the hedges, silvering them, and the station lay quiet again, emptied of voices, but not of memory. Miss Marple stood by the ticket window, gloved hands folded over her bag, her eyes drifting toward the far bench where the crimson hat had rested. The station master, Mr. Greaves, was sorting timetables, his movements slow and methodical. He looked up when she approached, polite but uneasy. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. You've been keeping an interest in our little mystery, I hear." She smiled faintly. "An interest in people, Mr. Greaves. Mysteries just happen to involve them." He hesitated, then leaned closer. "You know, the woman from London, Lydia Rowe. They say she worked in Melchester once, typist at the solicitor's office. I remembered her when I saw her picture in the inspector's file." "Indeed?" "Yes. Years ago. Came down here with her employer once, Mr. Ellison. Proper man, older, married. Folks whispered, but you know how they are." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes. Whispering requires much less evidence than truth." He gave a soft chuckle, then lowered his voice. Funny thing is, that same Mr. Ellison used to live in the vicarage before he moved to London. Bought this very watch from my father. Recognized it soon as I saw it yesterday. Her gaze lifted slightly. The watch found by the platform? He nodded. His initials are inside the case. Barely visible now, but still there, if you catch the light. Must have been hers to keep, or his to take back. Miss Marple looked toward the rails. 2 names, 2 pasts, still circling each other like the trains that never met. What became of Mr. Ellison? She asked quietly. Died last year. Sudden heart seizure, they said. His wife passed not long after. Strange timing. The drizzle thickened, soft as breath on glass. She thought of Lydia Rowe, the calm precision of her speech, the restraint of someone used to weighing words before letting them live, and the perfume. Jasmine. Not worn for vanity, but memory. The scent of an old promise, one that had outlived its keeper. Was there any child? She asked. None. Just the widow and her husband's clerk. Fellow left after the funeral, I think. Jenkins knew him. Said they'd worked together once. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her umbrella handle. Patterns. Always the same pattern. Love, silence, inheritance, guilt. All tidy until time decides to stir the dust. She thanked him kindly and turned to leave. As she reached the gate, she noticed a faint scratch on the iron post, a set of initials, faded but clear enough to read. L.E. Lydia Ellison, not Rowe. The drizzle deepened, the scent of jasmine caught briefly in the air, and Miss Marple's face softened not in surprise, but in quiet recognition. Some wounds, she murmured, age gracefully, others rot. It was nearly dusk when Miss Marple found Jenkins at the station, standing by the signal shed, cap in hand, his broom forgotten at his side. The light was failing fast, and the air held that stillness which often comes before a confession, the hush of someone too tired to keep pretending. He turned when she approached, his face drawn, eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said softly. "Didn't think anyone be about." "I find," she replied, "that people tend to unburden themselves when they believe no one's listening." He managed a weak smile. "You always was sharper than you looked." They stood in silence for a moment, the steady tick of the signal clock filling the space between them. At last he spoke. "I knew her, miss. Years ago, before she was Mrs. Ellison or Lydia Rowe or whatever name she took later. I was a clerk then, worked under her husband." He rubbed his hands together, rough palms scraping. "She weren't bad. Lonely, maybe. Too fine for him. She'd come to the office, always quiet, always careful. But there was something in her restless, like she was waiting for a train that never came." Miss Marple said nothing. Her gaze rested gently on him, the way a mother might look at a child who's already confessed through silence. "She left one day," he continued. "Didn't take a thing. Just walked out. He fired me soon after, said I'd been careless with the accounts. Maybe I was, maybe not." He swallowed hard. "Years later, I met her again by chance. Here, of all places. Same perfume, same eyes. She said she'd come, back for something that belonged to her." "The watch?" Miss Marple asked softly. He nodded. "Said it was hers by promise, his gift, before the wedding. But the old man's widow wouldn't give it up. She begged me to get it back. Said she couldn't rest until it was done." His voice faltered. "So I took it. Didn't think she'd follow me here. Didn't think she'd—" He stopped, the word too heavy. "She came to the platform after midnight," he whispered. "Wanted to talk. To thank me, I think. But she looked strange. Said time had cheated her. That the watch should stop where her heart had stopped years ago." Miss Marple's hands folded quietly. "And then?" "She stumbled," he said. "Or maybe she leaned forward, I don't rightly know. The fog was thick, and I reached out too late. She fell. No scream. Just gone. Like the night took her back. The signal clock ticked once, steady as guilt." He drew a ragged breath. "I didn't mean to hide it. Only, people don't forgive clumsiness when it ends in death. Miss Marple looked toward the rails, her expression unreadable. She didn't mean to kill truth, she said gently. Only delay it. Jenkins bowed his head, and the clock ticked on. The morning began too quietly for comfort. The fog was gone, replaced by a brittle sunlight that seemed to expose rather than warm. Miss Marple was setting her tea when the sound of hurried footsteps broke the calm unusual in Street Mary Mead, where people preferred dignity to speed. It was the station boy, cap askew, eyes wide. "Miss Marple, they can't find Jenkins," he blurted. "Can't find him," she repeated mildly, though her voice thinned slightly at the edges. "Not since last night," the boy said. "His coat's gone. His broom, too. Station master thought he'd gone home early, but his house is locked from inside. Curtains drawn. No one's seen him since the late train passed." She thanked the boy and sent him off for a bun at the tea shop, something to occupy his mouth before the story grew legs. Then she reached for her hat. The station was nearly empty when she arrived, though the air carried that peculiar stillness that follows disruption. Mr. Greaves, the station master, was pacing near the office door, his watch chain trembling slightly with each turn. "Vanished, Miss Marple, just vanished. His cap's on the peg, his pay untouched. It's as if the ground swallowed him." Miss Marple looked toward the platform. The broom leaned neatly against the bench, bristles still damp. Not carelessness, preparation. Jenkins hadn't fled in panic. He'd tidied before leaving, as though keeping up appearances for one last time. "Any trains after midnight?" she asked. "One," said Greaves. "Freight line doesn't stop here. Passes through at 12:30. Her eyes drifted toward the rails, their metal edges gleaming under sunlight. Nothing disturbed. No footprints. No struggle. Just absence, clean, deliberate absence. Mrs. Fletcher appeared at the gate, breathless and half-delighted. "They're saying he confessed," she exclaimed. "That he killed her and ran. Poor man must have known the police were coming." Miss Marple turned slowly, her expression kind but firm. "Rumor always arrives before reason, Mrs. Fletcher, and it never buys a return ticket." The woman faltered under the gentleness of the rebuke, muttered an apology, and retreated to share it elsewhere. Miss Marple studied the ground once more. Something small caught the light near the track, a coin. Not lost, but placed. Half buried in the cinders, its face upward. A railway token. She bent to pick it up. On the back, faintly etched, were two initials, L.E. She stood there a long time, the coin cold against her palm. Guilt had its own logic, she knew. It didn't drive people away from where they'd sinned. It pulled them back, over and over, like the tide reclaiming its own debris. Somewhere down the line a whistle blew sharp, fading fast. Gone. And in its echo, Miss Marple could almost hear the truth Jenkins had left unfinished. Running doesn't change direction, it repeats it. It was 2 days later when the letter surfaced. The Morning Post, bundled in its usual sleepy way, brought it to Miss Marple's cottage. No sender's name, no stamp, just a folded envelope slipped quietly under her door, the kind that travels by hand, not post. The handwriting was unmistakable. The same measured loops, the same restrained elegance as before. Lydia Rowe, or Lydia Ellison, had written again. Only this time, there would be no reply. Miss Marple sat at her table, drew the curtains halfway, and opened the letter with steady fingers. The paper was faintly scented jasmine, but weaker now, as if the scent itself were fading with its purpose. "Dear Miss Marple, I expect this will reach you after things are settled. You were kind when no one else was, and though you do not know me, I think you understand more than you should. I did not come here for vengeance. The past is too weary a thing to chase. It tires the heart before it satisfies it. I only wanted to be seen, once more, by the place that forgot me, to hold something that once proved I mattered. The watch was not his. It was mine, given before I became someone's mistake. I never hated him, only the silence that followed. But silence becomes its own kind of death after a while. When I heard his widow still kept it locked away, I thought perhaps she too could not let go. Now I see she was keeping what was left of him safe. It seems we both loved the same ghost. Tell the kind man who helped me that I forgive him for what came after. We were both too late. Peace, as I said once, comes by walking away, and I am tired of standing still. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her eyes resting on the handwriting a moment longer. No self-pity, no confession, just quiet truth, written by someone who had stopped living long before she stopped breathing. She rose and crossed to the window. Outside, the children of the village played near the lane, their laughter cutting through the mild air like sunlight breaking a cloud. The world had already moved on, as it always did. She looked toward the path leading to the station, empty now, save for the glint of rails in the distance. There was peace in that stillness, but not forgiveness. Forgiveness belonged to the living. Recognition was all the dead could hope for. Miss Marple placed the letter among her papers, beside the list she had written nights ago. Fear, guilt, hesitation, truth. She underlined the last word once lightly, as though acknowledging its weight. She didn't seek revenge, she murmured, almost tenderly. Only recognition. The week ended quietly, as most endings do in Street Mary Mead. By Sunday morning, talk of Lydia Rowe, Lydia Ellison, as it was now known, had already softened into that safe kind of village memory that no longer threatens tea-table comfort. The inspector had moved on. Jenkins was listed as missing, presumed, drowned, and the station ran its timetable again, as if time had never paused at all. Miss Marple took her usual walk after church, a small bunch of garden daisies in her hand. Not roses. Roses made statements. Daisies remembered quietly. She followed the narrow path that curved behind the churchyard wall and opened into the small burial ground that overlooked the line. From there one could see the rails glinting in the sun, stretching toward Melchester like threads unspooling from the past. The caretaker looked up as she entered, tipping his cap. New headstone came in yesterday, he said softly. For the lady from the station. Simple thing. No family name given, just her initials. Miss Marple nodded. That seems right, she said. Some lives close more gently without explanation. She found the plot easily. Fresh earth, a wooden marker bearing only 2 letters. L.E., no date, no verse. Just enough to be known by those who chose to know. She knelt, the damp soil cool beneath her gloves, and set the daisies at the base. For a moment she stayed there, neither praying nor thinking, just letting the silence do the speaking. The church bell struck the quarter hour. The sound folded over the fields, rolling toward the station, where the whistle of the noon train answered faintly like an echo from the living world. Miss Marple rose slowly, brushing the earth from her skirt. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and grass, ordinary scents, but they carried a new gentleness today. She turned toward the bench by the gate, the same one where Lydia's hat had been found. From her bag she drew a small envelope, the letter the woman had written, and slid it beneath the flowers. No one would read it now, but that didn't matter. Some truths belonged to the keeping, not the telling. She sat for a while, watching the rails shimmer under the Sunday. Each passing train sent a faint vibration through the ground, a reminder that motion continues even when stories end. Life, she thought, is much like that, steady, indifferent, but sometimes merciful enough to give closure in whispers rather than thunder. A child's laughter floated from the churchyard gate. 2 little girls were playing with petals, scattering them along the path. One of them waved. Miss Marple smiled back, her eyes kind, her heart very still. As the next train passed, she lifted her gaze to the horizon, where distance softened everything, even memory. Then, in the hush that followed, she said quietly, "Some peace is earned by remembering, not forgetting." Evening drew itself thin across the village. Like the last line of a letter, no one had the courage to finish. The church had fallen silent, the shops shuttered, and the scent of rain drifted faintly over the hedgerows. Street Mary Mead had resumed its quiet rhythm, though beneath that stillness something faintly trembled, an afterthought, a note not yet resolved. At the station, the lamps burned low. Mr. Proplick. Greaves, the station master, locked the office and stood for a moment by the gate. He glanced toward the far end of the platform where the crimson hat had once lain. Then, shaking his head, he muttered, poor woman, and walked home. When the last of his footsteps faded, the platform belonged again to silence. But silence, Miss Marple always said, was rarely empty. She was right. Inside the signal shed, where the dust still carried the faint sweetness of jasmine, a faint creak disturbed the quiet. The ledger on the desk, Jenkins's old duty book, lay open to a page that hadn't been touched since the night he vanished. Someone had written something new across the bottom margin. 3 words, in a hand that wasn't his. Forgive the delay. The ink was fresh, still wet. A breeze slipped through the half-open door, turning the pages with delicate patience. They fluttered, then settled again, as if reluctant to reveal more. Outside, the rail lines gleamed faintly in the moonlight, silver threads stretching into forever. At her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window with her tea cooling beside her. She hadn't gone to the station that evening. She didn't need to. Something in her had already shifted an intuition, soft as breath, telling her that what remained unfinished had found its own quiet completion. She thought of Jenkins, the porter with tired eyes. Of Lydia, the woman who had returned only to disappear again. 2 people bound by regret, separated by truth, and joined again by consequence. Their stories had crossed like rails, meeting only long enough for sparks to fly before diverging into distance. The letter, the perfume, the watch, each a clue, but more than that, each a confession of sorts, not written for law but for understanding. Outside, a distant whistle rose, long and low, the late freight train from Melchester. It didn't stop here, hadn't in years, yet every night its echo passed through the valley like a reminder that time never truly abandons what it touches. Miss Marple closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of the wheels faint through the night air. Not mournful, not triumphant, simply inevitable. The sound rolled through her small cottage, through the garden gate, and down toward the empty platform, where the ledger's ink was finally drying. Justice, she knew, never hurried. It walked with the patient stride of conscience, slower than law, slower than trains, but utterly certain of arrival. Her lips curved in a faint, knowing smile as the whistle faded into silence. Justice travels slower than trains, she whispered. The night settled soft over Street Mary Mead, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from stories reaching their final breath. The lamps burned low in the cottages. The last teacups were washed and dried. Only the faint hiss of the railway line, far across the fields, carried any movement at all, metal cooling, echoing what had already passed. Miss Marple sat by her window, shawl drawn tight, her eyes tracing the dim outline of the horizon. The station light flickered once, distant but familiar, like the blink of a memory refusing to go out. Somewhere down the line, a whistle called a single, mournful note, and then faded into nothing. On the small table beside her lay 3 things: the folded letter, the silver watch, and one daisy, its petals slightly curled from yesterday's Sunday. She had kept them not as evidence, but as echoes. Every mystery, she knew, left one the quiet part of truth that survives after words have done their work. The village would move on, as it always did. Mrs. Fletcher would bake again, the postmistress would misplace another letter, and the church bell would strike its neat quarters without a thought for the silence between them. But for Miss Marple, silence had never been empty. It was the pause that carried meaning. She lifted the watch, listening. It ticked softly, still holding to its false time 11:48, refusing to join the rest of the world. And in that stubborn sound she heard them both. Lydia Rowe, who came seeking remembrance, and Jenkins, who vanished, trying to atone. 2 lives intersecting, not for justice, but for recognition. The law would never mark them, but the truth already had. She rose and walked to the door. The air outside was cold, scented faintly of rain and jasmine. That perfume lingered, softer now, almost kind like forgiveness, carried on the wind. It brushed her sleeve and was gone. She stood at the garden gate, watching the empty road. The rails beyond glinted under the half-moon, long and silver, stretching into a distance that promised nothing except continuity. That, she thought, was life itself. Stories closing, others beginning, all part of a quiet procession no timetable could truly hold. Somewhere, another whistle rose, a late train perhaps, or merely the echo of one long gone. It sounded like breath, not noise, like truth exhaling at last. The faint tremor passed through the ground beneath her feet, a reminder that motion never ends. It only grows quieter when it finally understands its destination. She turned back toward her cottage, closed the door softly, and let the silence return to where it belonged. The clock ticked once, steady and sure. The night listened. Her voice, low and certain, broke it just long enough to leave its final imprint on the air. Truth doesn't return with noise. It arrives quietly, like the next train.